Imagine being trapped in a burning building. Would you prefer to be rescued by a well-meaning amateur who's never held a fire hose, or a rough, unfriendly firefighter with years of experience? Your life depends on this choice. Yet when selecting leaders who control the fate of millions, we consistently choose charming amateurs over competent professionals. In 2005, Hurricane Katrina unleashed its fury on New Orleans, claiming over 1,800 lives and inflicting $125 billion in damage. The true catastrophe wasn't the storm itself, but a stunning failure of leadership. FEMA Director Michael Brown, appointed despite minimal emergency management experience, failed to mobilize resources even with days of advanced warning. The Senate later delivered a damning verdict. Katrina was a national failure, an abdication of the most solemn obligation to provide for the common welfare. Brown wasn't malicious, he was simply outmatched by the crisis. This disaster exposes a chilling truth that Niccolo Machiavelli recognized 5 centuries ago: well-meaning incompetence destroys more effectively than calculated malevolence ever could. In his masterwork The Prince, Machiavelli argued that a leader's fundamental responsibility is effective governance, not moral posturing or noble intentions. It is better to be feared than loved, if you cannot be both, he wrote, recognizing that ineffective leadership, however well-intentioned, inevitably leads to suffering and societal collapse. This exploration will transform how you evaluate those who seek authority over your life, your community, and your future. By the end, you'll understand why history's greatest catastrophes weren't orchestrated by villains, but by incompetents who genuinely believed they were doing good, and why the most dangerous words in leadership aren't "I intend," but rather "trust me, I mean." The Dunning-Kruger effect. When we think of dangerous leaders, our minds conjure images of tyrants, calculated evil figures who deliberately cause harm, yet history tells a more nuanced story. The truly catastrophic periods in human civilization often weren't orchestrated by evil geniuses, but by well-meaning incompetents who lacked the skills to achieve their aims. Consider the psychological phenomenon known as the Dunning-Kruger effect, where unskilled people overestimate their abilities. Kruger and Dunning demonstrated that people who lack competence in particular domains tend to dramatically overestimate their abilities. Later research by Anderson and colleagues found that individuals with the least expertise were significantly more likely to seek leadership positions during group tasks, despite their lack of qualifications. The greatest damage to civilizations isn't caused by those who intend to destroy, but by those who believe they can build despite lacking the necessary skills. When incompetent leaders gain power, they typically surround themselves with similarly incompetent advisors, not out of malice, but because competent people threaten their self-image. This directly contradicts Machiavelli's counsel that a prince ought to be a great asker and a patient hearer of truth. As he warned, the first opinion that is formed of a ruler's intelligence is based on the quality of the men he has around him. Examine the collapse of the Roman Empire under Honorius, widely regarded by historians as well-intentioned but catastrophically incompetent. While external threats existed, the empire's inability to respond effectively stemmed largely from leadership failures. As historian Edward Gibbon noted in The History of the Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, the reign of Honorius reveals perhaps more clearly than any other period how the fate of empires rests not on the malevolence of enemies, but on the competence of those entrusted with their defense. Gibbon's insight aligns perfectly with Machiavelli's view that a leader's primary duty is the effective protection of the state. For a more contemporary example, consider Zimbabwe under Robert Mugabe. Initially hailed as a liberator, Mugabe's economic policies, particularly his land reform program, implemented with incompetent execution, transformed Africa's breadbasket into a nation plagued by hyperinflation and food shortages. His intentions to correct colonial injustices were arguably noble, but his catastrophic incompetence and implementation led to far greater suffering than a more calculating but competent leader might have caused. Have you ever found yourself preferring a competent adversary over an incompetent ally? That instinct might be evolutionary wisdom speaking. In competitive environments, predictable competence, even opposed to your interests, allows for strategic response. As Machiavelli observed, there is nothing more difficult to take in hand, more perilous to conduct, or more uncertain in its success than to take the lead in introducing a new order of things. The halo effect, one of the most pervasive cognitive biases we face, is the halo effect, our tendency to assume that people who possess one positive quality, like kindness, must also possess others like competence. This psychological shortcut becomes dangerous when applied to leadership. Groundbreaking work by Todorov and his team at Princeton University demonstrated this bias in action. When researchers showed participants brief exposures to the faces of political candidates, they could predict congressional election outcomes with approximately 70% accuracy based solely on facial appearance, particularly traits associated with perceived competence. Yet follow-up research revealed virtually no correlation between these perceived traits and actual leadership performance. We are, in essence, selecting leaders based on how competent they look, rather than how competent they are. We don't select leaders based on competence, we select them based on their ability to appear competent, a distinction that has shaped and destroyed civilizations. This bias becomes particularly dangerous when combined with our natural preference for moral character. Recent research by Brush and colleagues found that moral traits significantly influence leader evaluation across diverse cultural contexts. Their multinational study revealed that voters consistently weigh perceived moral character heavily when evaluating political candidates. This aligns with earlier research which showed that voters often prioritize perceived trustworthiness over demonstrated performance in certain electoral contexts. Machiavelli would be appalled but unsurprised. He wrote, "Men judge generally more by the eye than by the hand, because it belongs to everybody to see you, to few to come in touch with you." This observation reveals Machiavelli's understanding that appearances often trump substance in leadership selection, a psychological vulnerability he believed competent leaders should strategically exploit. Think about a time when you supported someone, a political candidate perhaps, or a workplace supervisor, primarily because they seemed trustworthy or relatable. Did you examine their actual track record of competence with equal rigor? Corporate settings provide a striking example of this bias. Research by Kamar Premusic analyzed leadership selection patterns and found that charismatic candidates were significantly more likely to be selected for CEO positions, despite showing no correlation with actual performance. Meanwhile, PwC's strategy and annual CEO success study, examining thousands of leadership transitions, found that externally hired CEOs, often selected for their charisma, were approximately 30% more likely to be dismissed for performance issues within their first 3 years. But our biases aren't the only problem. Well-meaning leaders often create disasters by ignoring their own limitations, which leads us to the unexpected consequences of good intentions gone. Ari, the philosopher Hannah Arendt, coined the phrase, "the banality of evil," to describe how ordinary people can commit atrocities through thoughtlessness rather than malice. But there's an equally important concept we might call the catastrophe of good intentions, the way well-meaning but incompetent actions create far more damage than calculated malevolence. Research from the Institute for Government examined policy-making effectiveness across multiple countries and found that initiatives framed primarily in moral or ethical terms frequently suffered from implementation challenges. Their analysis of major policy initiatives revealed that policies designed with explicit normative goals often lacked sufficient attention to practical execution, resulting in a significantly higher rate of unintended consequences compared to those designed with clearly defined pragmatic objectives. Why does this happen? Moral certainty often prevents leaders from properly assessing risks. Good intentions create a psychological permission structure for bypassing normal safeguards, and when leaders frame their decisions in moral terms, criticism becomes more difficult, cutting off valuable feedback loops. The most dangerous leaders don't declare their malice, they declare their certainty. This insight aligns perfectly with Machiavelli's central thesis in The Prince, that governance should be judged by outcomes, not intentions. As he famously wrote, "In the actions of all men, and especially of princes where there is no court of appeal, the end justifies the means." While often misinterpreted as an endorsement of cruelty, Machiavelli was actually making a pragmatic observation that leaders must be judged by the actual effects of their policies, not the nobility of their stated aims. Consider the catastrophic Great Leap Forward in China, where well-intentioned but drastically misguided agricultural policies led to the deaths of an estimated 30 million people. Mao Zedong wasn't trying to cause a famine. He genuinely believed his initiatives would increase food production, but his moral certainty, combined with an unwillingness to heed warnings from agricultural experts, created one of history's greatest humanitarian disasters. Similarly, India's well-intentioned 2016 demonetization policy, intended to fight corruption and tax evasion, caused enormous economic disruption that disproportionately harmed the poor. Prime Minister Modi's moral righteousness about fighting black money prevented him from implementing the policy competently or listening to economic advisors who warned of implementation problems. The psychological mechanism here is what researchers call moral licensing, the phenomenon where people who see themselves as moral feel permitted to act less ethically in subsequent decisions. As psychologist Daniel Lefine observes, when people feel they've established their moral credentials, they worry less about appearing immoral in subsequent behavior. A leader convinced of their own moral rightness will often take riskier actions, ignoring expert advice and dismantling safeguards that might slow their moral mission. Think about it this way: would you rather fly with a pilot who's kind but untrained, or one who's grumpy but highly skilled? In a plane, the answer is obvious, but when selecting leaders, we often make the opposite choice, a mistake Machiavelli would find not just foolish but catastrophic. Evil versus incompetence. One of the most troubling aspects of this phenomenon is how differently we respond to evil versus incompetence. When we perceive evil, we mobilize quickly, our psychological defenses activate, and we unite against a common enemy. But incompetence rarely triggers the same urgent response. Research by Feldman and colleagues on the moralization of everyday behaviors found that participants consistently rated moral transgressions as more serious than competence failures in workplace settings. Their behavioral experiments revealed that individuals were willing to incur significantly higher personal costs to avoid collaborating with colleagues they perceived as ethically compromised, compared to those they viewed as merely incompetent, even when the incompetence would likely cause greater practical harm. Society has built robust defenses against evil, but remains nearly defenseless against incompetence cloaked in good intentions. This asymmetry plays out clearly in organizational settings. When a leader commits an ethical violation, organizations typically respond swiftly, terminating employment or implementing new safeguards. But when a leader demonstrates incompetence, the response is often far more measured: additional training, restructured responsibilities, or extended probationary periods. Machiavelli understood this asymmetry well. He observed that people react strongly against perceived cruelty, but are remarkably tolerant of incompetence that causes far greater harm. As he wrote, men are less concerned with offending one who makes himself loved than one who makes himself feared. Our emotional preference for well-meaning leaders blinds us to the greater damage their incompetence may cause. Consider Greece's debt crisis of 2009 to 2018. Years of well-intentioned but fiscally incompetent governance created a situation that caused massive unemployment, poverty, and social upheaval. The Greek population suffered far more from this incompetence than they would have from more austere but competent fiscal management. Yet the incompetent politicians who created the crisis often faced less public outrage than the technocrats who implemented painful but necessary reforms. Psychologically, this makes sense. Evil triggers our threat detection systems. It feels dangerous and foreign. Incompetence, however, feels familiar and non-threatening. We all experience it ourselves, and we're socially conditioned to be forgiving of honest mistakes. Furthermore, criticizing incompetence often feels mean-spirited. It's socially acceptable to condemn malicious actions, but questioning someone's competence, especially when they're trying their best, feels like attacking their intrinsic worth. Ask yourself, how often have you remained silent about incompetence because the person seemed well-intentioned? How often have you given second chances to those who meant well but consistently failed to deliver? The Peter Principle, while malice is often self-limiting because it generates opposition, incompetence can persist indefinitely within systems. This principle was famously articulated in what became known as the Peter Principle, the observation that people in hierarchical organizations tend to rise to their level of incompetence. In simpler terms, people get promoted based on success in their current role until they reach a position where they can no longer perform effectively, and there they remain. An analysis by Benson, Lee and Xu examined data from 214 companies and provided empirical evidence for the Peter Principle. They found that companies routinely promoted employees based on their performance in their current role rather than management potential, resulting in a significant decrease in team productivity when high-performing individual contributors became managers. What makes systemic incompetence so pernicious is how it creates cascading failures that become normalized over time. When incompetent leadership becomes the standard, performance metrics are adjusted downward, expectations are lowered, and what once would have been considered unacceptable becomes the new normal. Evil systems collapse under their own oppressive weight, but incompetent systems can persist indefinitely, protected by the very virtues they claim to uphold. This insight aligns with Machiavelli's observation that maintaining the stability of the state requires constant vigilance against incompetence. As he noted, whoever desires constant success must change his conduct with the times. Systems that cannot adapt due to entrenched incompetence eventually fail, but often after causing enormous suffering. Have you noticed how difficult it is to reform systems that everyone agrees are failing? The resistance rarely comes from malicious actors but from well-intentioned people who simply lack the competence to envision or implement better alternatives. Consider the case of large-scale government projects. A comprehensive study examined 258 major infrastructure projects across 20 countries and found that 86% exceeded their budgets, with an average overrun of 28%. Yet rather than being seen as evidence of systemic incompetence, these failures were typically attributed to unforeseen circumstances, explanations that protected the incompetent decision-makers while ensuring similar mistakes would be repeated. As management expert W. Edwards Deming once observed, "A bad system will beat a good person every time." Deming's insight underscores how critical systemic competence is. Even highly skilled individuals cannot overcome fundamentally flawed organizational structures. This systemic nature of incompetence reveals another troubling dimension, how it spreads through organizations like a contagion, creating what we might call incompetence cascades. Incompetence cascades, Perhaps the most troubling aspect of incompetent leadership is how it propagates throughout organizations and societies. Unlike evil, which tends to create resistance, incompetence often creates more incompetence through several well-documented mechanisms. Research by TED tracked the effects of poor leadership on employee performance across multiple organizations. The findings revealed that employees working under incompetent or abusive managers showed significant declines in problem-solving abilities and productivity over time. This aligns with Robert Sutton's extensive work on toxic leadership, which documented how poor management systematically degrades organizational capability. The true cost of incompetent leadership isn't just what they do wrong, it's the competence they destroy in others. This cascade effect would not have surprised Machiavelli, who understood that virtue and capability in leadership shape the character of the entire state. As he wrote, "The actions of a new prince are more closely observed than those of a hereditary one." Leaders set standards that permeate entire organizations and societies for better or worse. Consider the collapse of the Soviet Union. While ideological factors played a role, the Soviet system's inability to adapt stemmed largely from entrenched incompetence protected by ideological orthodoxy. By the 1980s, Soviet leadership had become so divorced from reality that they couldn't accurately assess their own economic conditions, leading to systemic failure affecting millions. Why does this happen? First, incompetent leaders provide poor models for learning. Second, they create environments where excellence isn't recognized or rewarded appropriately. Third, they often establish dysfunctional processes that constrain even capable individuals. The neurological basis for this cascade effect is what neuroscientists call mirror neurons, brain cells that activate both when we perform an action and when we observe others performing it. When we're continuously exposed to incompetent behaviors and decision-making processes, these patterns become encoded in our neural pathways, influencing our own behaviors even unconsciously. As leadership expert Jim Collins noted in his research on organizational decline, a company's decline often begins with the adoption of mediocrity as an acceptable standard. Collins's observation reminds us that incompetence doesn't just affect individuals, it reshapes organizational cultures and expectations. Consider your own experiences in workplaces. Have you noticed how quickly practices deteriorate under poor leadership? How excellence becomes exceptional rather than expected? How mediocrity becomes not just tolerated, but institutionalized? These aren't random occurrences, but predictable outcomes of incompetence, unprecedented complexity. We live in an era of unprecedented complexity, from climate change to artificial intelligence, from pandemic response to global economic systems. The challenges facing modern leaders require higher levels of competence than at any previous point in history. This increasing complexity makes the dangers of incompetent leadership exponentially greater. Research on policy complexity by Lisak and Rivkin documented the exponential growth in regulatory and policy complexity over recent decades. Their analysis of major government initiatives showed that modern policies involve significantly more interconnected variables and feedback loops than comparable initiatives from earlier eras, creating governance challenges that traditional leadership models struggle to address. As our world grows more complex, the gap between required competence and actual leadership capability widens, making incompetence an existential threat rather than merely an inconvenience. Machiavelli recognized this challenge even in his time. He observed that leadership requires adapting to changing circumstances, what he called fortuna, translated as fortune. As he wrote, "I conclude therefore that fortune varying and men remaining fixed in their ways, men are successful so long as fortune and policy are in accord, and when there is a clash they fail." In today's rapidly changing complex world, this adaptability becomes even more crucial. Consider how different countries responded to the COVID-19 pandemic. Nations with competent, adaptive leadership like Taiwan, New Zealand, and South Korea experienced vastly lower death rates than countries where leaders either denied the problem or implemented inconsistent, scientifically unsound policies. The human cost of this incompetence was measured in hundreds of thousands of preventable deaths. This creates what complexity theorists call a competence gap, the growing distance between the skills needed to address our challenges and the actual capabilities of those in leadership positions. This gap helps explain why well-intentioned policies increasingly produce unintended consequences despite good intentions. Neuroscientist Ian Robertson has documented how increasing complexity affects decision-making. His research shows that as system complexity increases, intuitive decision-making, the kind favored by charismatic but untrained leaders, becomes exponentially less effective. In high-complexity environments, structured analytical approaches and domain expertise become not just beneficial but essential. As systems theorist Donella Meadows pointed out, we can't control systems or figure them out, but we can dance with them. Meadows' insight reminds us that addressing complex challenges requires leaders with the humility to acknowledge complexity and the competence to navigate it adaptively. Imagine trying to solve a Rubik's Cube blindfolded by following your intuition. Now imagine trying to solve global warming the same way. The complexity of modern problems requires methodical competence, not just good intentions, If incompetent leadership is indeed more dangerous than evil, what solution did Machiavelli propose? Contrary to popular belief, his writings weren't simply a manual for a moral power-seeking. Rather, he advocated for a concept of virtue, not moral virtue as we typically understand it, but a kind of practical competence in governance. Machiavelli's virtue encompassed the skills, judgment, and effectiveness needed to achieve positive outcomes in complex political environments. In his treatise The Prince, Machiavelli presents virtue as the counterforce to fortune. While fortune represents unpredictable circumstances beyond a leader's control, virtue represents the capability to navigate these challenges effectively. As he writes, "It is better to be impetuous than cautious, for fortune is a woman, and it is necessary, if you wish to master her, to conquer her by force." This metaphor, while problematic by modern standards, emphasizes Machiavelli's belief that competent, decisive leadership can overcome even the most challenging circumstances. Modern psychological research supports this Machiavellian view. A comprehensive meta-analysis by Judge and colleagues examined leadership effectiveness across multiple studies and found that cognitive abilities, a key component of competence, consistently predicted leadership effectiveness across diverse contexts. Their analysis established that practical competence remains one of the strongest predictors of organizational outcomes, even when accounting for other leadership qualities. The most ethical decision a leader can make is to step aside when they lack the competence to lead effectively. This finding challenges our conventional understanding of ethical leadership. We typically equate ethical leadership with good intentions and moral character, but if incompetence predictably leads to harm, then competence itself becomes an ethical imperative, a perspective Machiavelli understood 5 centuries ago. Consider Singapore under Lee Kuan Yew. While criticized for authoritarian tendencies, Lee's exceptional competence transformed Singapore from a poor colonial outpost into one of the world's most prosperous nations. His focus on pragmatic outcomes over ideological purity exemplifies the Machiavellian principle that effective governance, even when occasionally harsh, serves the common good far better than well-intentioned incompetence. Consider medical ethics as an analogy. We would never consider it ethical for a person with no medical training to perform surgery, regardless of their good intentions. The potential harm from incompetence creates a moral obligation to develop competence before attempting to help. Yet in leadership, we routinely accept good intentions as sufficient qualification for positions that affect thousands or millions of lives. As philosopher Philippa Foot argued in her work on virtue ethics, virtues are not just good intentions, but the reliable dispositions to act effectively toward good ends. Foot's perspective highlights how true virtue requires not just wanting good outcomes but having the skills to achieve them, a view that aligns precisely with Machiavelli's concept of virtue. Machiavelli's insight was that governance is a skill, more like medicine or engineering than a moral calling. Just as we wouldn't want a surgeon who is kind but incompetent, we shouldn't accept leaders who have good intentions but lack the skills to govern effectively. A moral imperative, we began with a counterintuitive discovery that incompetent leadership may cause more harm than malevolent leadership. Through our exploration of psychology, philosophy, and Machiavellian principles, we've seen how good intentions without competence create devastating consequences, how our cognitive biases blind us to incompetence, and how complexity magnifies these dangers. Machiavelli's dark truth remains as relevant today as it was in Renaissance Italy. Competence in leadership isn't just a practical concern, it's a moral imperative. The most ethical action a leader can take is to develop genuine competence or step aside for someone more capable. This perspective challenges us to rethink how we select and evaluate leaders. It suggests that our tendency to prioritize perceived moral character over demonstrated capability may be causing unintended harm, and it reminds us that the road to societal dysfunction is often paved with good intentions backed by insufficient skills. The neuroscientist Antonio Damasio once noted that we are not thinking machines that feel, we are feeling machines that think. Damasio's observation reminds us that our emotional responses often drive our rational judgments, not the other way around. Our emotional preference for well-intentioned leaders is deeply ingrained in our neural architecture. Overcoming this bias requires conscious effort, a willingness to evaluate outcomes rather than intentions. Machiavelli would urge us to judge leaders not by their character, charisma, or stated intentions, but by their demonstrated ability to achieve positive outcomes for the societies they lead. As he wrote, "The vulgar crowd always is taken by appearances, and the world consists chiefly of the vulgar." Breaking free from this cognitive trap requires us to become, in essence, less vulgar in our judgments, more focused on results than appearances. So what can you do? Start by auditing your leader's competence. Ask for results, not just promises. Sever results, not just promises. Develop what psychologists call knowing what you don't know, the awareness of where your own knowledge ends and expert knowledge begins. And when choosing who to follow, vote for, or promote, ask yourself, am I selecting based on who makes me feel good, or who has actually demonstrated the ability to achieve positive outcomes? In a world of increasing complexity and urgent crisis, competence isn't just a skill, it's survival. Thanks for watching. If you found this video valuable, share it with someone who values results over rhetoric, and don't forget to subscribe for more insights on leadership, philosophy, and psychology. Remember, today's choices decide tomorrow's future.